Hello everyone, today I'm reviewing Game 1 of the Ouza title match between Fujii Sota and the challenger Nagase Takuya. Now, I think this is a rematch of the Ouza match from last year, and Nagase actually had a chance, at least I think, to tie the game, to tie the series 2-2, or maybe even to win it. But he had like a gigantic blunder at the end of the one of the key games. He just like couldn't recover from it. But he's getting a chance again to challenge Fujii. So let's see how he does. And so in game one, Nagase got Sente. And they started with double static rook. And I think everybody's expecting double static rook for the entire match. And they go into a bishop exchange opening. But actually, Fujii has a curveball here for Nagase, which is the move bishop to 3-3. Normally, you just go ahead and exchange the bishop from your side. But instead, Fujii says, no, I'm going to make you take my bishop. Usually, now this in the olden days, I think, or I mean, even now, it looks a little bit strange, I think. It was thought to be bad to do this because now your gold is kind of out of place. But relatively recently, one of the players, I think he's now actually in the A-League. Now, I can't remember exactly what his name is, but he came up with a system where this works. And so Fujii kind of came with a bit of a curveball here, and he's testing Nagase, saying, hey, like, do you actually know this system? And spoiler, he pretty much did. But they go ahead and proceed almost like a normal bishop exchange. Now, I think normally Fujii would be playing reclining silver in normal bishop exchanges. And I'm not super familiar with this system. And he decides to go with a bit more, I would say, an aggressive route, which is hayakurigin. Essentially, in bishop exchanges, you have three options of how you use this silver. One is to come this way and play reclining silver after pushing this pawn. One is what Fujii has done here, which is hayakurigin, and the other is boging, right? Boging is not super common in professional levels. Reclining silver, I would say, is the most popular. That's what Nagase here is going for. But hayakurigin, I think, generally works. It's a more aggressive option. And let's just see how Nagase deals with it. So he goes ahead and goes for his reclining silver, and Fujii goes ahead and tries to kind of castle his king. Of course, the downside of this is that your castle looks kind of wonky and is not super great. But yeah, like it's again, I have personally actually haven't seen this, so it's still, looking at it from my eyes, it does look a little bit funky to have the gold on 3-3. But yeah, it kind of just proceeds as a regular hayakurigin versus reclining silver. And Nagase goes ahead and retreats the silver to protect the 7-6 square. And they just go ahead, they trade edge pawns, and then Fujii goes ahead and trades off his 7th file pawn. And now here, Fujii decides that he's going to take his silver on a little adventure to try and capture this pawn on 4-6. And Nagase says, you can have it. I don't really care. And so Fujii goes ahead, gets the pawn, and Nagase just decides he's going to go ahead and castle his king to safety. And Fujii's like, hey, mission accomplished. I'm just bringing my silver back. This is kind of like a funny sequence here. Essentially what happened was Fujii spent 4 moves capturing this pawn. In exchange, Nagase got gold up and king all the way over to here. That's basically the trade that happened, is a pawn for these 4 moves, which is pretty rare that you see someone spend 4 moves to just capture a pawn, but apparently it works here. The tempo loss isn't that big of a deal. And so here Nagase kind of gets the action going. With this pawn drop on 7-2, obviously you have to take it. And he's now able to drop his bishop to 8-3 and make a horse back on 4-7. And this structure is very Nagase, I guess is the way that you put it. He's very well known for playing very defensively, very solidly. And this position is very solid. He's got 4 generals, kind of around guarding his king, and he's made a horse that also defends his camp. So I think this is very Nagase, I would say. And so Fujii goes ahead, pushes his 5th file pawn. Nagase goes ahead and pushes his 3rd file pawn, getting ready to jump the knight. And Fujii needs to activate this silver and kind of like fix his castle a bit, which was weakened because he had to recapture and move the gold to 3-3. They go ahead and put in edge pawn exchange here. Nagase goes ahead and pushes his pawn to 5-6, and Fujii drops his pawn back on 7-4. And what this is doing is just preparing silver to 7-5 to trade silvers. Nagase goes ahead and says, yeah, okay, you can trade your silver. I don't really care. I'm going to get my knight going because this gold is now a target. Fujii decides to first stop the knight from jumping. And then we have a little bit of a funny move order here where Nagase moves his horse back up to 4-6. This is essentially pinning the silver to the rook, and so he can't make this silver trade right away. And apparently Fujii really wants to trade those silvers, and he decides that it's worth dropping his bishop back on the board in order to do it. All right, so now he can go ahead and bring the silver up and just recapture with the knight if there's a bishop trade. And, that's a bishop trade that Fujii would love. Okay, it's like I get to trade my bishop for your horse. And so Nagase decides, well, I made you drop your bishop, so I'm going to go ahead and just move right back. So some really interesting, maneuvering in the early game here with, this 4 moves that Fujii spent to capture the pawn, and now kind of some back and forth with the horse just to kind of force the bishop out of Fujii's hand. And so here, now that he's prepped it, Fujii goes ahead and trades silvers, and Nagase then makes this move, gold to 5-7. It's not like immediately obvious what the point of it is, but the point is essentially you want to prevent this this silver drop on 4-6. And Fujii goes ahead, kind of finishes his castle in a way. I actually have no idea what this castle is called or if it even has a name. It's kind of got this Mino style structure, or even I guess since it's not on the back rank, it's closer to Gangi, but the gold is on 3-3. And that is actually a structure that happens and appears in Gangi games as well, for a variety of reasons. So maybe that's kind of the inspiration for why it's okay to get that gold up on 3-3 is that let's just make this structure, which is kind of like a variation of Gangi. Nagase goes ahead, gets his rook out of the way, right? This bishop was staring at it through the knight. And Fujii gets things moving with this pawn push. Nagase takes back, and then a dangling pawn on 9-6. So these types of pawn drops, you usually don't want to recapture them. In this case, if you recapture, then you're going to have a lance trade, and your king's going to be pretty unsafe. And so Nagase decides to go on the attack with pawn to 5-5. And the idea behind this is actually to activate the horse along this diagonal, and it threatens a silver drop on 8-3. It's actually pretty interesting. You don't see these types of moves very often, and they both kind of had it where he was threatening this silver drop backed by the bishop, and it's the same thing with this pawn push. It's opening up that silver drop on 8-3. And interesting, Fujii just decides to take the edge pawn with his lance, and he says, yeah, okay, you can drop that silver, I don't really care. So essentially, if you're trying to kind of evaluate this position, engine just gives, okay, basically even. But you'd say probably Nagase has better activation of his major pieces. He's been able to make a horse. His rook is pretty good, whereas Fujii's rook is pretty bad. The bishop isn't great either. But he has this edge attack, right? And so Nagase's king is a bit more in danger. So that's kind of why I guess the engine evaluates as relatively even. The peace activity is better for Nagase, but his king is a bit under attack by this edge attack. So Nagase wants to try and get things moving on his end, so he goes ahead and does a really common tactic, which is called Tsugifu, or connecting pawn, something along that's kind of how I would translate it. You kind of sack a pawn, and then you sack another pawn right after it. And it's very common to do this in order to enable your knight to jump. And generally speaking, you don't want to take these pawns either. Now, in this case, the engine actually wants to take it. And it has a crazy line that it likes. I think it's something along the line. Okay, you can just take. If the knight jumps, you can go ahead and threaten it with the gold. The idea on Nagase's side is a move like knight to 1-3. And this is threatening trading this, but also a discovered attack on the pawn. But it turns out that you can kind of just drop a pawn here. And then you can just basically sack all the pawns that you have in hand in exchange for being able to take this knight. And this is still, according to the engine, pretty much an even game, but maybe a little bit favored for Fujii. And that was an option, but Fujii decided not to take the pawn, and that's kind of how people respond to Tsugifu, which is you just ignore it. And instead, he kind of relocates his bishop to a better diagonal. So he already succeeded in getting his lance up here. He doesn't need the bishop backing it up anymore. And so now he wants to go ahead and scope this 9-7 square to make his edge attack even more of a threat. So here, Nagase plays a super Nagase move, which is the silver promotion back to 9-4. So I think here the intuitive move, the obvious move, is actually to promote back this way. And actually this is what the engine wants to do, right? Is this silver promotion this way? Okay, like you're hitting the bishop, and you have a bit more influence towards the middle of the board, and the silver is closer to the king, right? But Nagase's style is very defensive. It's very much so, I want to stop your attack and make sure that I've kind of prevented you from, being able to do anything that you want to do. And so his move here, it's a very simple idea. I just want to take your lance, and I want to kind of get rid of this edge attack, which is the one thing you have going in the position. And so Fujii says, okay, yep, I need to cash this edge attack in. Let me go ahead and trade my lance for your knight. And then he goes ahead and takes back the pawn on 5-5. Nagase goes ahead, takes the pawn that was left to him on the second file. And this is the very standard defense of Tsugifu, is to ignore it, let them take the pawn, and then drop your pawn back on 2-2. And Nagase really goes for it here. He drops the lance immediately on 2-8. Now the engine here has a crazy line where instead of dropping this lance, it wants to push this pawn. And it's actually really hard to explain why it wants to do this. But essentially, there's some lines where basically the engine wants to force the bishop back and away from this diagonal. Specifically because in some lines, the bishop is able to sack itself for this lance and stop the attack on the second file. So here, Fujii ends up going into something like a 20-move pre-calculated sequence, I think, is what some of the announcers or commentators were saying. That is really complicated, and even me trying to analyze this game, the sequence really starting from here is extremely complicated, and there's so many variations that it's going to be a little bit hard to cover everything. I'm going to try my best here, but the basic idea is that Fujii wants to make knight drop on 7-6 work. Now the problem with doing knight drop to 7-6 right away is that the king can just run to 7-8, and then when you try and drop your silver on this side of the board, they can just take it, they can just trade it off, and then here there's not really any continuation of an attack for Fujii. So instead of dropping the knight right away, what he decides to do is to drop the silver onto 5-6 first. Now here I think you might come up with maybe 3 options. So first, maybe you want to take the bishop. If you take, you can take back, and it's a kind of an even trade. Maybe you take with the silver, maybe you take with the gold. So now taking the bishop actually doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work is because you can actually take the horse, and when the gold runs away, now you can drop this knight. And Sente is in a lot of trouble here. Essentially, you have to take this knight with the gold. If you try and run the king, you get into a lot of trouble with bishop drop on 3-8. Your pieces are forked. So you have to take, but this is just like a terrible position, right? Like, there's an attack here. Your king is all by itself. Your silver is hanging. There's still this threat of a bishop drop. So this is not recommended, right? Taking the bishop doesn't work because of this line. Now, if you try, let's say, and take it with the silver, this also doesn't work. He can recapture with the pawn. You can't take with the horse because your knight hangs. So you have to take it with the gold, but after taking with the gold, instead of the knight drop, that was the initial idea, you can actually just push your pawn. And when the gold recaptures, you have silver drop on 6-7, and this is winning, essentially, for Gote. There's some complicated lines even after this, but a lot of them are just very, very good for Gote. It's extremely hard to defend this as Sente. And so, really, that means you're kind of left with just recapturing here with the gold. And it's the best move according to the engines. And the interesting thing here is, at first, and even when you let the engine run for a while, the engine wants to recapture the gold with the pawn, or at least the Lishogi engine does. But then when you start making the next most obvious moves, for example, knight jump, all of a sudden things aren't looking as good for Sente, or sorry, for Fujii. In these variations, Nagase ends up doing pretty well once you actually kind of let things run. And so it turns out that here there's a really nice sequence, which is to actually drop the knight now. And the reason why dropping the knight now works is you can't really capture with the silver because pawn takes, gold takes, and then here you can't recapture this pawn, remember, because you need to stay defending the knight. And now the gold is away from your king. It's very open. So if you try and go for this knight move, actually here you can just ignore it and drop the silver on 6-7. And this is just too difficult. Again, it's a very similar variation to the earlier one, but it's just too hard to defend this as Nagase. So yeah, in all of these like confusing variations, Fujii finds this this like perfect timing to drop the knight. Now, what the engine wants here is to just run the king to 7-8, and then after pawn takes, to then go ahead and start with the knight attack. I think the reason why Nagase didn't go for this is that actually you can just take the pawn with the gold, and when the knight promotes to 1-3, remember I think I mentioned that the engine wanted to do this pawn 6-5 move to try and kick the bishop back. It's in this variation where you can actually sack the bishop for the knight, and then in this position drop a gold, and now this attack is dead. So like, okay, you can take this way, But now again, the gold survives, and you have no attack anymore, and you can just recapture the knight. And if you try and maintain the attack on the second file by running the king, your king is just in so much trouble. And after knight takes, you actually can't even take the gold anyway because there's lands drop on 2-3. So I think this is what Nagase saw and wanted to avoid. Now, Engine says it's actually not that bad here. And against lands takes 9-3, you don't take the gold. What you do is pawn drop on 5-3. I don't really get it. Okay, I mean, okay, like, it's... Okay, I guess he's setting up this. It's still like super confusing. I mean, this looks super dangerous for Nagase's king, but Engine says Nagase's it's like plus 1.7. But this is I don't know if this is human findable. Like specifically like this king to 8-9 move is just wild. But that's what the Engine wanted, and now I guess that was kind of Nagase's chance, is to actually allow this. But he didn't want to go for that. And what Nagase ended up doing in this position is running his king to 9-8. Now the problem with running the king to 9-8 is that when the pawn takes the gold on 5-6, it's an immediate threat mate of gold drop on 8-8. And so Nagase has to defend by dropping a silver. You could try and defend by the gold, but it's actually a lot more dangerous because now you only have one piece, and like all of Fujii's pieces are gonna come in. It just becomes almost impossible to defend, and even this position is pretty much, I would say, lost for Nagase already. And so Fujii goes ahead and promotes the pawn. They make this bishop trade. And Nagase goes ahead and kind of tries to go for his initial attacking idea, which was this knight jump to 2-5. Fujii finds the best move, so gold up to 2-4. And we saw a similar variation to this earlier. And Fujii finds this move, bishop drop on 6-8, as like an intermediary move. And obviously, the main threat is to take the gold. And so Nagase decides to run the gold. But then he goes ahead and recaptures the lands. Now here, if you try and take the bishop, there's promoted pawn here, essentially completely killing your attack. So instead, Nagase goes ahead and takes the gold. And this is actually kind of a similar idea to the variation we saw earlier, Nagase try and avoid, which is sacking the bishop for the lance. Except in this variation, in order to recapture the bishop, Nagase then loses his rook to this lance drop. So I think this was the problem with what Nagase ended up trying to go for. It's like it's the worst variation of the other bishop sack line, where this lance drop doesn't happen, right? Because you're recapturing the bishop on 2-8 instead. So here Nagase goes for this pawn drop on 5-3, and Fujii goes ahead and just takes the rook. Now here, I mean, it's a slight mistake according to the Engine. The Engine just wants to run the gold, and it's like, hey, like this rook is dead anyway. You can take it later. Like, why are you just giving him the gold? But, I mean, Fujii's answer is because, essentially, I think what Fujii's answer is because he wants to get his rook in the game, right? And so taking the rook and then letting him capture the gold and being able to get the rook onto this fifth file, it's helping him activate his rook. I think that's kind of what he was thinking. But the problem with it is that Nagase has a move, gold drop on 5-3. Now this feels not great, right? Like worst case scenario, it's like, okay, there's like this two-piece exchange, and it's not great for Fujii, but this is like the absolute worst case scenario of what can happen. But actually, in this position, and this is probably why Nagase did not go for this, even though the engine likes it the best, there's this rook drop on 5-8, which threatens this gold and is threat mate on the king. So for example, if you take the rook, there's immediate rook takes on 7-8. You can't take with the silver because gold is mate. And so your only option is to defend with the gold, but actually you can just take it with the knight. And when the silver recaptures, you have this nice move to finish the mate, which is knight on a6. So I'm guessing Nagase didn't like this variation and decided he didn't want to drop this gold. Now the engine gives this variation of taking the silver, and after the king recaptures, to drop your bishop on 6-5. And the idea is it's check, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the knight. I'm going to sack my bishop for the knight to kind of like stabilize my position a little bit. It's still dangerous, obviously, because then the pawn's going to come here, but at least buys you a bit of time. And this is kind of what the engine thought was Nagase's kind of like last chance to keep the game going. Instead, Nagase goes for me, it was a real head scratcher, which is this gold sack on 4-2. I think what he was hoping for is king takes, and then gold drop on 5-3, rook takes, silver takes, king takes. It's kind of gross. It's like a 3-piece exchange. You just lost 2 golds and a silver for the rook. But at least in this position, he got rid of the rook. He didn't allow the rook drop. And so his king is still like a little bit safe, and he has a couple pieces to kind of do, make things a little bit complicated. And, like in this position, the engine thinks the best move is to run the king up the board, right? So at least here, it's complicated. And I think this is what Nagase was hoping for. But it turns out that you don't need to take with the king. There's a much better move, and Fujii finds it, which is to take with the rook. Again, it feels a little bit strange-ish because you just moved the rook here to try and activate it, but I mean, it's a pretty obvious move, right? Like when you take with the rook, like your king is completely safe now. And here, I mean, there's still this threat. I mean, there's still some sort of rook drop threat anywhere. So here, Nagase does kind of obviously okay, like let me go after the rook. But again, rook drop on 5-8, threat mate, and threatening to take silver, so you have to take the rook. But then when the king recaptures, Nagase really has no attack here, right? Like any rook drop is met by a pawn drop on 5-2. And so here the game is basically decided. Nagase decide, but Nagase is Nagase. He's going to try and defend till the bitter end. And I think the last trick that Nagase had up his sleeve was this bishop drop on 5-1. Now the idea here is if you take with the king, which is kind of the most natural move, there's this move, bishop drop, which forks the gold in the king. So it kind of keeps the game going. Now, I mean, the engine still thinks that this is good for Fujii. But at least, you're not getting mated right away, right? It's going to take a little bit longer, and maybe there's some ways that Nagase can find to defend here. If you take with the rook, well, then I can take this gold. And obviously now your rook's not here, so you're not attacking. Now, in both of those situations, both of these variations, it's still winning for Fujii, but just not quite as much as the top move, which Fujii finds, which is to just run the king. And, basically the attack just doesn't quite work, right? And you can, again, run the king to 3-1. And just so happens, obviously, that the silver guards the key square where you would need to drop the rook for mate. And then also the knight covers this one. And so in this position, Nagase resigned. There's really nothing he can do to defend anymore. And obviously, as you can see, there's really no attack left. This is like a pretty strange game, I thought. It started out as expected, I would say, and entering this bishop exchange, and then Fujii had this bishop to 3/3 variation where he recaptures with the gold, which kind of like makes a strange structure for his king. Um, but he navigated it really beautifully, and he really showed his strength as an attacking player with this Hayakuri king. And Nagase, he played okay. He played very much so in his style, I think. But I think there are just a couple places where, playing in that very defensive style really came back to bite him, where he just didn't quite. And then the hard part about playing these very defensive styles is it's on you to make all of the right moves, right? Where as soon as you make a mistake, the game ends because you defended incorrectly. Whereas if you're the one attacking, then it's on your opponent to make all the right moves. Now, to be fair, I guess if you're a professional player, you're expecting yourself to make all the best moves. It kind of makes sense to play defensively, and both Fujii and Nagase and really a lot of the top players are very good defensively. But yeah, so I guess that'll probably be the theme for this match: Fujii attacking and Nagase defending. And I think it's going to be a little bit difficult for Nagase if he keeps kind of taking that defensive stance against Fujii. He's probably the best attacking player that's ever played the game, and you saw it, with that really complicated variation and sequencing of moves in the middle game was really, really. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be able to learn anything from it, but it's at least impressive. I think that's the thing that I see with a lot of Fujii games. They're impressive moves that are really hard to replicate. So yeah, we'll see how Nagase bounces back in game two. I'm not actually sure when game two quite is, but as soon as it happens, I'll be putting out a review. So thanks for watching.